brute strength is nothing compared to the damage that intellectually honed but not guided intellectual prowess can do. If you pin your whole life on being the smartest person in the room, you are going to meet someone who is smarter than you. They're going to be able to run circles around you, and it is not a sustainable model. And if you take advantage of the few times where you are, or maybe not few times, maybe many times that you have the highest reasoning power in a room, oh, well, then a Theseus is going to come around the corner, and unfortunately, that happens to Theseus himself because he abandons that lesson.
Heaven knows anyone who went through academics at the college and especially at the postgraduate level knows how much stock people put into their IQ, their intellectual prowess as markers of their self-worth. This whole idea, oh, so-and-so is smart, so they need to be the head of a unit, or so-and-so is smart, so let's give them control of entire government agencies or beyond.
What could you possibly be referring to?
Yeah. Not any logical fallacies that actually occur in the world right now. Today we are trapped inside the Mythslayer Cafe, going room after room after room, trying to find our way out. But you know what? Really, we like being here so much that we're just gonna hang out, and I'm gonna have a nice long talk with Dylan Odhner about mazes, monsters, and a lot more. Dylan, welcome to the Mythslayer Cafe.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in and keep up with the Myth Cafe heading out.
You never know what happens at the Mythslayer Cafe. That's why I love it so much. So today we're going to discuss the myth of Theseus. He is really one of my favorites in the whole Greek set of stories. Who is Theseus, Dylan? Why does Theseus speak to you?
Theseus is by far most known by so many with his situation and experience with the labyrinth, the golden thread, the minotaur, etc. But Theseus is not your typical hero. There are some things that make him pretty unique, and that's why I resonate with him a lot. As you see today, I'm going to be talking about this not just in sort of this romantic hero worship sort of way. He has two sides of his story, or I would really break it down to three. So, of course, this in the middle of his Odyssey, you could say, is this incredibly important for metaphorical reasons, for mythological reasons, even just as a day-to-day metaphor of the labyrinth, that experience in our lives, whether that's an underworld journey, comparative sort of thing, or something else. But so there's that instance, but I really break Theseus's life down into sort of three segments. There's his birth and becoming a hero, and becoming a hero that is unique from Hercules, who he sort of hero worships at first and wants to emulate. He wants to emulate his father, Aegeus, so he's trying to be, like so many of us, he's trying to be the classic type of hero instead of favoring his own skill set. So he needs to develop and grow out of that process before the second session, which would be the battle of the labyrinth, we could call it, where he goes in, defeats the minotaur, and finds his way out again. And then, unfortunately, the last segment of his life is much more centered around this hero becoming a bit of a tyrant. This is something that happens with so many heroes, where they become the monster they sought to slay, becomes entrenched in his own thinking, and the very things that he was so good at take this turn for a bit of a darker aspect, and he becomes tyrannical, he becomes a little bit paranoid, and he ends up passing away in a way that sort of was foreshadowed at the very beginning of his life, unfortunately. So really, that's the full sway of Theseus's experience. I'm sure we'll be touching on a bunch of those particular aspects in more detail later, but there's Theseus.
I can already tell that this episode is going to be incredible. The beauty of Greek myths is that, as you point out, they have such unbelievable multidimensionality and comprehensiveness with regards to the lessons that they teach. Disney and Hollywood, for a number of totally legit reasons, in my opinion, simplified these stories and made them into a very easy to wrap your mind around and think you understand package of lessons and or images that stick with us and we believe show us the meaning of these stories. But part of why we have conversations like this one here at the Myth-Slayer Cafe is so we could get to the real heart of these stories, so that the messages that they bring to all of us about who we are, what we are capable of, what we can become, and what we need to avoid can be explored and discussed in a way that no other medium can. And you've pointed to that. Before we go any further, I do have to put in a plug for one of my favorite places on the earth, which is the island of Crete. I don't know if you've ever been there, Dylan, but if you haven't, it is a wonderful place to go, not the least of which is because the palace that the labyrinth was above is beautifully preserved. And you can go and walk around and feel the spirit of Theseus and the Minotaur and get a vibe as to what it might have been like back then. So it is a palace called Knossos near Iraklio, Greece. You can take a simple $3 bus from the center of Iraklio to Knossos and spend an entire day having the time of your life. I don't know if you've been there. If not, go. And then we're going to start talking about Theseus and Hercules, who we've discussed elsewhere on this show.
Yeah. So I've never been to Knossos, and I certainly, Greece is on the top of my list. I've been to Italy a number of times. I was somewhat late in my life before I ever got to really start traveling Europe, with a heading toward, at that point, a PhD in mythology. It was a no-brainer. I needed to do that. But even still, I found that, not being a teenager, a high school student, I had really developed the ability to absorb far more than most people do, even though it is already a life-changing experience for so many. Many of the people I traveled with, one of their favorite parts about the trip, this sounds so self-congratulatory, but was watching my emotional, absorbing of this at such a high level, because I had waited so long and had developed as a person before, and I'm not encouraging people to wait with their teen kids or anything. Get them there then, but when they choose it for themselves, there's a whole different level, I think.
That is so very true, and I can completely relate to that. I certainly wasn't traveling overseas as a teenager. Us in the backwoods of Kansas kind of just didn't do that.
Yeah.
But fortunately, the gods took me there ultimately. And as you suggested, before I went there, I had a chance to learn more about the mythical figures that are in the artwork and in the stonework and the archaeology and the stories that we talk about here at the Myth-Slayer Cafe, all over the place. And as I mentioned earlier, we have discussed Hercules on this show with a guest by the name of 𝗫𝗏𝗏𝗏. It's a fascinating and very energetic episode, as would befit Hercules. Hercules had 12 labors that he's famed for after he was cursed with madness, and that ultimately took him to a place where he, along with some other deeds that he was involved in, discovered who and what he truly was. His fate wasn't what he might have originally thought it was going to be, but after a lot of suffering and a lot of endurance and showing a lot of concern for others, he ultimately ended up on Mount Olympus. His legacy was, as you suggested, the hero that everyone pretty much in the entire world ever since has modeled their idea about what a hero is upon. Share with us, Dylan, why Theseus might have idolized Heracles or Hercules, and how his story ended up different, what that teaches us.
Yeah, that's a great intro. Heracles or Hercules is, as you've said, I won't say primordial. He's the archetypal hero. No doubt about that. Everyone kind of knows that. He's not as brutish and dumb as people like to pretend. There is more complexity to him. But I did want to take sort of a depth psychological approach for a second. I have a quick quote from James Hillman, who's sort of a post-Jungian, who said, quote, Hercules entered the realm of the shades in order to take something. And while he was there, he wrestled, he drew his sword, he slaughtered, and was confused about the reality of images. Each of us tends to be Hercules in ego when we begin to engage imaginal figures. So I just wanted to read that because there's a real sense in which heroism is oversimplified in a sort of Hercules way. The assumption that if you're going into the underworld, you need to destroy something and slay it, and that proves your heroism. It's very ego dominated, this idea. It's not the only form of heroism, but it's the one that captures especially young men's minds so much in every aspect. So Theseus himself lived in a world already affected by Hercules. Just to give a comparison, his father, 𝗪𝗪us, was a fairly classic hero and founder of Athens, at least the city, not the sort of spirit of Athens. The Oracle of Delphi tells him to not loosen the bulging wineskin until he reaches Athens, basically saying, don't drink before or else your son is destined to destroy you. So he doesn't listen, and he doesn't understand what this is. And as happened in myths, he ends up going against that. He impregnates a woman, and then once Theseus is born, he basically says, I have to go be king back in Athens, and I don't know whether I want to claim this child for my own or not. So what he does is he takes his sword and sandals, he places them under a huge boulder that only a Hercules Aegeus type hero could move, and then tells the mother of Theseus, when he comes of age, tell him who his father is and tell him about this challenge for him. Is there any better metaphor for the positive and negative expectations of the father figure and saying, do things how I did them? And that's the only way you can prove that you're worthy of me. Well, Theseus is going to be far beyond Aegeus in terms of his actual effect on the world, the way that we remember him. Yeah, we remember the Aegean Sea and something, but Theseus is a far bigger figure. So Theseus grows up hearing about Hercules, obsessing over his 12 labors, wanting to be like that, and then, lo and behold, knowing that there's something different about him. And when he comes of age, his mother tells him about his father, and Theseus has zero trouble doing the classic hero strength test, pushes the boulder, grabs them, and then goes to claim his birthright. So at that point, he's really no different than Hercules. He's not archetypally different than an Aegeus, right? So that's when we start to get this development. And I think this is where this will apply a lot to this Myth-Slayer Cafe model, what you're trying to get to here. How does this apply to our lives? Because just to take this briefly, as he starts heading toward Athens to confront his father and claim his birthright, he runs into 5 or 6 bandits in the woods. They're each of different sorts. And you start to see the difference between Theseus as a hero and some of these other heroes. Heracles or Hercules, he defeats everything with brute strength. And he has unparalleled brute strength. The Nemean lion, you've been through it in the Myth-Slayer Cafe. But Theseus runs into a uniquely reason-based or fallacy-based group of enemies. And this is just wild. Each one of them, I've come to decide, represents a particular logical fallacy. So
Wow.
Theseus, and even his name almost sounds like the word thesis. He comes from Athens, although he doesn't know it yet. Athens' patroness being Athena is all about not just intelligence, like Apollonian, Apollo-like intelligence, chess, etc., but strategy and even wisdom-guided strategy. I love to think about her as a war goddess because strategy, yes, it's about winning wars, but you win wars in order to end wars. I'm not saying she was some pacifist or anything else, but there's a form of logic that comes from her that, if guided properly, she comes out of the forehead of Zeus. It represents this very particular important form of wisdom coming from an actually good place. So that's what Theseus starts to develop. So I won't go through all of them, but I did want to talk about a few of these challenges, these bandits he meets on the road. So one of the first ones he runs into is a figure by the name of Procrustes. So he's an innkeeper, a very odd innkeeper. Theseus comes along and, like dozens or hundreds of travelers before, Procrustes invites him in and says, "Oh, would you like a room? I've got a room, and it's even better than that. I'm going to feed you, and I have this magical bed." And this magical bed fits exactly the size of travelers as they come. So Theseus, like every other person before him, comes in thinking, wow, this bed must change its shape to meet exactly the length of the traveler. Well, in fact, it's a trick. And what he means is the bed will fit the person lying in it because he will sneak in the middle of the night and stretch them out on the rack, fatally killing them. Or if they're too tall for this bed, he'll cut off their feet, again, fatally. So I'm just going to throw this at you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but regardless of the name, there is a word to be Procrustean, which is not very used. But you have any thoughts on what that could mean in terms of logic? How Procrustes, how that fits in a day-to-day or fallacy sort of standpoint?
I'm going to cheat a little bit with the answer, Dylan, because we actually had an entire episode devoted to Procrustes. The guest's name was Thomas Lanthaler. Yes, and I am putting the link right up over my shoulder. Thomas Lanthaler's interpretation of the Procrustes stories was that it is a cautionary tale about the risks of trying to fit in to preordained structures, and that ultimately they will destroy you. And as a matter of fact, the title of that episode is "I'm an Outcast and I Love It," because we explore how, if you are able to truly demand that where you go into the world fits itself around you, or at least you position yourself authentically, not confined within that iron bed, you are more likely to be able to not only succeed, but feel better about yourself. So I'm going to steal Thomas's answer here because I thought it was so good. And hey, I was an outcast when I was in high school, so I could personally relate to it. But with that in mind, let me toss it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's a fallacy, a logical fallacy with a fancy Latin name that I won't go into, that's sometimes called forced fit, right? If you go in to studying history with a preconceived black and white set of understanding, you could even talk about Procrustean logic or thinking when you talk about the Renaissance or the High Middle Ages versus the Low Middle Ages, etc. These different boxes that are very useful when looking back and saying, can we organize this information? But if you've preset it, you start to imagine that someone was, if the Renaissance started in 1300, the idea that someone 2 days before, in the tail end of 1299, was born, and then his younger brother is born a year later. Oh, Mario, Luigi, we now have entered the Renaissance, right? That there would be anything discreetly different about these two people because you are now forcing them to fit. It's the same idea that someone is innately able to drive a car because they had their birthday last night and are 16 now. We know
Right.
that's not the case, and there's no problem with this kind of thinking when it is about organizing in order to understand afterward, dissecting and reorganizing to understand the things as they are. So yeah, that would be force fit. So in each of these cases, again, I'm not going to go into all of them, Theseus turns the table, almost literally, turns the bed, and identifies the trick. So you can imagine in a conversation that logical fallacy, someone trying to catch you in a trap like Procrustes and saying, oh, you have to choose between these and these because this is the only way you can view the world. Theseus flips the script and starts to show his difference as a hero by saying, no, this is a Procrustean fallacy, you could say, and he affixes Procrustes to his own bed. So he moves on. I'll just do one more of these to give a real clear sense that it really is this parade of logical fallacies that he's facing against in the woods. So there's another bandit.
Please do. I love it.
Yeah. Named 𝗓𝗔, who I connect to the false dichotomy, the fallacy. When you're in a conversation and they say, you can't have there are only two kinds of people in the world. Are you this or this? Well, I didn't agree to this initial circumstance. And in this case, what 𝗓𝗔 does, his actual name means, I think, birch bender or pine bender. He catches travelers, everyone until Theseus comes along, and quickly ties them by ropes between two bent over pine trees. So they're being pulled in two directions, and he effectively says, hey, would you rather be stretched to your death, or I can cut this and you can be flung to your death? Well, that seems like a false dichotomy. A third option might be, please let me down. This isn't very kind, right?
Right.
So, of course, Theseus catches him in the act. So you get this idea of Theseus going through and one by one, this Athenian kind of reasoning starting to emerge, right? There's 𝗖𝗵𝗲, who represents an appeal to authority, at least in my thinking. When someone says, oh, I'm right, simply because, well, I read a study on it. Are you saying you are smarter than all these doctors? I just read a big book, and he's the world's authority on this. Well, there's nothing wrong with appealing to authority if both people agree to that structure. But in this case, the mythological comparison is 𝗖𝗵𝗲 lures travelers to this peak, this cliff, and he, through threats, forces them to wash his feet. So a clear act of subservience. Hey, you are subservient to my position. And then as they're down washing his feet, he kicks them over backward, toppling them off of a cliff to their death. So I'm not going to go through any more of these, but there really are a number. That last one was very important because, spoiler here, Theseus ends up dying by being tricked up onto a cliff where he is pushed off by another king after he's been exiled from Athens due to some very negative trends in his leadership style. So, yeah, so I think that's the most important sort of group for that section before he even gets to Athens reclaims its birthright and heads toward the labyrinth.
So there are some rabbit holes that I want to go down to with regards to 𝗓𝗔 and 𝗖𝗵𝗲. Let's start, though, by pointing out that, from my perspective, this part of the Theseus narrative shows not only the aspirational nature that I see that myths share about leadership and personal development, but they also are presenting these villains almost as alternate versions of what the hero can become through the cautionary tales. Really, when it comes to 𝗖𝗵𝗲, you hit that nail on the head. 𝗖𝗵𝗲 is the final figure the one that Theseus is able to overcome using his essentially his own tools against him. But Theseus himself ends up succumbing ultimately to that very alternate version of himself. In other words, the 𝗖𝗵𝗲 part of the story to me represents not just a cautionary tale and the revelation of a logical fallacy that many people encounter in leadership and that we're going to talk about more in a second, but it also represents the prophetic nature of the way our lives often play out, the irony that the universe seems to so often bring into day-to-day existence, particularly those with the ambition to try and become their own versions of mythical heroes or even Olympians, and that we forget about at our own peril.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I'll just say, I think the reason this resonates so much with me has to do with discourse in today's world. When you're talking about social media, when you're talking about any form of discourse, academia, etc., we have so many logical fallacies flying around. But I think that's not the only problem, right? Theseus is on great footing here and is a true, well-driven hero at this point because of why he's using these tools against these people. And what I mean by that is, with all of these, if these do represent logical fallacies, and Theseus represents the emergence of Athenian reason in discourse, well, there are times when it's important to be able to, quite frankly, defeat someone in debate and discussion. When are those times good? Well, it's not to be showing off at a bar somewhere and showing that you're the biggest, baddest logician, right? That you can beat people in discussion. That's what it becomes on social media so much today. But what it is defending the truth or defending people. At this point in his story, Theseus is defending passersby that he doesn't even know in the woods. He's clearing out the woods of logic, of reason, so that people can have discourse in a fair way by outlining, oh, this is not just one bandit in the woods. This represents a whole logical fallacy. And once I identify it and we start to get that out in the world, this person, this politician can't use this as willy-nilly to hurt people and defend falsity, quite frankly. So I really think Theseus's intention is so important because, like you said, this foreshadows the unfortunate irony in this case about how Theseus becomes a tyrant himself, where he's pushed over a cliff himself. That's because at that point, he's trying to defend his own role and trying to reclaim it. He's trying to maintain his status as the best logical hero and king, right? So
there is nonetheless another dark side even to this section of the Theseus narrative that I think is worth exploring a little more, which to my eyes, ears, and heart goes more or less as follows. These are logical fallacies that are only presented to Theseus, and the villains are only able to be villains because these logical fallacies work. Embedded in the narrative is that each of these three villains had played these tricks upon dozens, maybe hundreds, even thousands of people before Theseus was smart enough to come along. And there is some symbolism there that I also feel is worth considering when it comes to being a leader. But it's a scary sort of, cynical sort of symbolism. If I want to galvanize people, if I want to dominate and oppress, if I want to be able to get my way through means that are intellectually, morally, even spiritually dubious, well, here's the playbook. And the only risk you have is that someone like Theseus would come along. But people like Theseus coming along are really rare for the exact reasons that you've discussed. The strength-based, the I'm big, badass, Herculean model of leadership, which has its place and it resonates for a reason, is how people usually tend to look at others, both as potential leaders or potential people that they will follow, and how they are viewed as potential threats. A huge amount of artistic effort has been put in over the past few thousand years in portraying Hercules in very specific physical terms over and over and over again. Theseus is a lot less intimidating. Theseus, in the representations I've seen, looks like a standard person, good looking, whatever, the appropriate age, but he's not shown with these bulging muscles carrying around this massive club with a helmet that's really a lion's head, or a hoodie basically that's made out of lion skin. He's a lot more. Yeah, right. And it also then points as to the fact that the mental threats that we might face, or the models for heroes that we may look to, particularly male heroes, since you're talking about social media, and let's face it, an example of the Herculean model being imposed on people in order to further justify the mythos around them is with regards to Donald Trump. The man, as of the time of this recording, is pushing 80 years old. He's not in good shape, but everywhere you turn around, there are paintings, there are memes, there are AI-driven short videos giving him muscles, looking like he's Superman. Why? For whatever reason, in order to correlate him completely as the hero his followers think he is, he needs to present in this Herculean model, as opposed to, let's say, a Thesean model, which, for all we know, Theseus could have been kind of schlubby himself. His mind wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're getting at there is when you say that, like Batman, for instance, where if you go through the rogues gallery for Batman, each one of these villains he faces being a flip side of him, a different opposite. I could talk for hours about that. But yes, you're exactly right. What makes these logical fallacies work is that they are themselves emerging forms of reason. They're false reason, but they are not pure myth, right? They are a form of an equation. Again, you can break it down if you have a Thesean mind. You can say, oh, that's not true, or an Athenian sort of reason. But these were working for quite a while because they look like reason and true reason. And if you aren't educated into a list of logical fallacies and their antidote, you fall for them every time. And you see people falling for them all the time now. Pointing them out doesn't do anything if someone doesn't actually understand that it being a logical fallacy means that it should be avoided. Even politicians that might come from a good place, that is because their whole goal is charisma and convincing. They have a certain number of tools in their toolbox, and they're hoping no one points out the logical fallacies within certain arguments. And that's an unfortunate reality for where we are right now. But if we had a more honed tool set ourselves for identifying that, we could at least say, I think I'm being swayed a little too much by an implicit appeal to force, right? Like, that's a logical fallacy. The Hercules model is one. If you make people think you're right by effectively threatening them, which happens a lot, that's its own form. And one of the many people that Theseus faces at this time looks a lot like Hercules. He's a brute with a big club, and Theseus turns the tables and say, even there, I can be bigger and badder than you even. So he doesn't do anything tricky there. He just flips the script and does the same thing right back at them. So a fascinating development of these different logical skills, pointing out in each case, as you pointed out, that none of these are innately wrong if it's coming from a place of reason. But as soon as you start using it as a tool to get your way, regardless of whether that's true or not, that's the issue, I think.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the next part of the narrative, Dylan. Okay, tell us what happened.
Okay, yeah, so Theseus, just to zoom forward, he makes his way to Athens. He confronts his father, who sees his sandals and his sword on this young boy who looks so much like a hero now, and suddenly we have a reunion with father and son. But all is not well in Athens. Athens is not the crown jewel of cities at this point in Athenian history.
Say that again.
Yeah, so the king Minos on Knossos is this tyrant of his own kind, and we could go into that story. But just to stick with what we've been talking about, I want to attach this whole thing to one more logical fallacy. When we talk about the situation that Athens under the thumb of Minos, the sort of situation is that every year a tribute needs to be paid, a tribute of 7 virgins and 7 warriors. Okay. In each case, they are offered up by Athens to appease this monster, this minotaur, in a labyrinth. Well, there is a logical fallacy called the unexplored problem. There's a different title for it, and again, a Latin phrase that I'm not going to go into, but the unexamined issue. If someone tries to argue, well, why should we do this nonsensical, crazy, violent thing? Well, because it's always been this way, and don't look too deep. This is the way it's done, right? That's the situation that Greece finds itself in here. All these subjugated cities, because they're afraid of the threat, but also because it is the way it's been going and it quote unquote works. We're going to send our best and brightest through a lottery system to die horrifyingly in this labyrinth. So Theseus, what does he do? He says, I'm going to examine this unexamined problem, right? So this is when Theseus is absolutely at his best. There's nothing hidden or sinister. This is a person who sees a horrific problem and wants to solve it with his own heroic nature. And he's trained himself through those bandits. So he volunteers himself. It's very much like Hunger Games, right? I volunteer as tribute. And he finds himself on a boat as a prisoner, although I'm sure he could break those shackles, but he has to show himself as this, oh, whoops, I got picked, even though he's actually the Prince of Athens. He arrives, and like everyone else, he's being told it's this honor to keep the Athenian way of life going by sacrificing himself. And now he is headed into the labyrinth. The labyrinth, we're not going to go into this minotaur and why he is there in the first place, but what's really interesting is this. Hercules, the archetypal hero, could not have made it through the labyrinth and out again. He couldn't have done it. What really makes Theseus succeed here is that he asks for help, which is so unusual at this time, right? And he acknowledges that he's going to need, from my mind, a methodology. He is entering a labyrinth, and maybe someone like Hercules could have killed the Minotaur, but then he could never have made his way out again.
Right.
He would have been driven mad down there in the depths. Theseus, and again, I don't think he seduces or tricks Ariadne at all, but this princess of Crete sees this beautiful hero and that he is asking for help, and she goes to Daedalus, who designed the labyrinth, and what she ends up doing is giving him the golden thread. And again, I used the word methodology because when you think of a thesis in an argument, when you think of a methodology for discourse, what it is this ability to enter the labyrinth while holding on to this thread, and whenever you're unsure Oh, did I already go this way? Have I been here before? Am I still on point? Like a thesis, you can tug on that and say, am I still connected to where I was and where I'm trying to get to? It's a system much better than breadcrumbs with Hansel and Gretel, that traces all the way into the labyrinth so that he can make his way to this minotaur and, quite frankly, put the minotaur out of its misery. He sees a problem, he solves it, and then he retraces his steps with this golden thread, makes his way out, and escapes with Ariadne. So there's a reason that that's so famous. But I wanted to throw it back at you and just, what's coming to mind when you think about this labyrinthine issue he faces?
A lot. First of all, that you're not going into a discussion of the origin of the Minotaur and what that symbolizes actually dovetails perfectly with a solo video that I just finished recording, and it's going to be up probably a little bit before your episode is released. The link is again above my shoulder, that goes into the background story of the Minotaur and what symbolically I believe it represents about each of us inside. The Minotaur, for those who might not know, had the head of a bull with these iron teeth that were gnashing, and he only ate human flesh. He had the body of, I imagine it like kind of like a bodybuilder, like an Arnold Schwarzenegger sort of thing. And he was utterly terrifying. But the circumstances of his birth were, to say the least, weird.
Complex.
But complex, yes. That's a way to describe it. And the characters involved, including the king of this area of Crete, have their own symbolic weight to them that are well worth exploring for anyone who's interested in leadership or self-development, because the Minotaur is something that we each can become, and it does ultimately lead to tragedy. I cannot help also but give a little bit of an advanced promo here. So I am in the process of writing a 4-book series that retells Greek myths in a futuristic setting with leadership and personal and professional development lessons. And in the second book, I will give a spoiler now. The entire tale of Theseus and the labyrinth is retold as an allegory of strategic planning and making steps with the assistance of others, both that have strategic vision like and are good planners like Ariadne, but also have technical expertise like Daedalus, in order to get you where you need to go. So it sounds like our interpretations are at a minimum dovetailing. I will say this though, adding on to what is either in that book or what you said earlier, which is my personal theory. And again, going back to the Athena interview with Summer Watson, Ariadne is this mentor-like or this sophisticated strategist that helps Theseus along when he asks for it. Exactly as Athena is with Zeus many times when he asks for it. I almost see Ariadne and Athena as the same figure, just wearing different dresses, and representing this idea, because they're both female, right, of maybe looking behind and beyond our gender biases when we're seeking advice, as well as an understanding implicitly within them that there is something in the feminine energy that brings out wisdom in a way that the male energy intellect can't necessarily arrive at on its own. But I want to hear what you have to say about all that.
Yes, though, Scott, I don't think this qualifies as a disagreement, but I absolutely agree in this context that this feminine, intuitive, guiding principle is absolutely what Ariadne represents, okay? But for me, it is mythos. You got mythos and logos, right? Even the word mythological is a combination of these two. So one of the ways I learned it was mythos is a form of unverifiable and non-argumentative discourse. Logos is a form of argumentative, verifiable discourse or truth. So when you read a novel, a fiction, it would be idiotic to say, "Oh, if that it's a fiction, there's no truth in there." We know that you can gain truth from poetry, from things that aren't even trying to be scientific fact. So when someone says, "Oh, I've learned something from this," they aren't necessarily talking about logos-centric knowledge. So for me, Ariadne is not this necessarily, and I will love to read your book and your take on it, but she's not necessarily everything that Theseus uses this golden thread for, a complex strategic thing. She is a feminine guiding principle that she gives to him for him to use, right? With his Thesean, Athenian, logical brain. So here we get the reason this is the peak of his story is because it is the time when mythos and logos are tied together most. He asks for help from Ariadne, she gives it to him, and he uses it, right? The problem is how much of a tragedy this is because of the next step in the story. So that's all I would say, is that for me, Athena is true wisdom. Yes, it is guided by some mythos, but it is a sharp, intellectual, strategic form of knowledge, whereas Ariadne is just sort of the warm embrace that you need to guide your, maybe even the impulse. Once again, I said this earlier, why are you having this argument? Or why are you wanting to win this argument? Not just how are you going to do it? The thing that guides why you're doing it in the first place.
One of the things that I absolutely love about Greek myths as allegories or fundamental statements about the human condition is that they, due to their richness and due to the complexity of the world in which they operate, they open themselves up to these varying interpretations. They can
Certainly
mean a lot to different people depending on what they bring into the room. And as a matter of fact, I hope to have an episode about this one day. There is even a debate as to what constitutes a myth. Like, what exactly is one? There's a great book on this called The Philosophy of Mythology, I believe. It's an old book from the 1800s. I believe it was written in Germany. And he breaks down all of these historical ideas about what myths were. Are they expressions of a culture? Are they expressions of an identity? Are they projections of the human subconscious? He doesn't say it that way, but that's sort of what you get. Are they purely literary creations? Were they pseudoscience? Were they all of these things and more? And so to the extent that there can be a very robust, centuries-long discussion about what a myth even is, the robustness of these sorts of conversations is part of the beauty of what myths, in the context of our discussions in this cafe, can bring into the room. It is only pointed out and brought to light even more. And by the way, one of the things I love about these disagreements is that the disagreement itself is illuminative, and getting a little bit meta here, in the context of this particular conversation, right, this specific disagreement kind of went as to, well, were we using fallacies ourselves when we were examining this story, right? And so again, the myths can reflect back upon themselves in ways that allow us to reflect back upon our own thinking processes, even as we are using those thinking processes to interpret them in the first place. I love that sort of shit. So anyway, Theseus and Ariadne escape. Let's get into the final leg of Theseus's story. And this is where things, in my opinion, get really deep and kind of dark.
Yes. Yes. So we said the peak of Theseus's story is when he uses his Athenian reason, this emerging form of reason that he's developed himself He's actually the inventor of wrestling, the concept of wrestling. So, debating. But Theseus has paired up with Ariadne to great effect. So for me, that's logos and mythos combined. And then, unfortunately and bewilderingly, the very first thing that Theseus does after fleeing with Ariadne from Crete is to abandon her on an island. It's heartbreaking for anyone who loves the story of Theseus, who wished that maybe this would be a less patriarchal story, etc. And yet, I think the consequences are so immediate, even though people don't really trace it to this moment. I do. Theseus's story takes a nosedive from this moment. What he's done is taken the gifts that Mythos lent him. His success is only because of this feminine, intuition-based guidance that guided his sharp intellect instead of and aimed it at the right things instead of through fallacy and through trying to tyrannically defeat. And yet, what's the first thing? He severs himself from that source and goes on unmoored from mythos, unmoored from intuition and guidance. The very next thing that happens after that bewilderment, because there's not even an in-story reason. Like, she's a beautiful princess, powerful princess. Right. She wouldn't have been a negative to his legacy. It's bewildering. So the very first thing that happens is that now, unmoored, unguided, Theseus forgets to switch his sails. So the ship of Theseus, we're going to maybe touch on that later, but Theseus had promised his father, Aegeus, who's just waiting for him to return, even though he's facing the Minotaur. And he says, Theseus, if you are still alive on your return, replace your black sails with white sails so that I know that things have gone the way I dare not hope they go. And Theseus agrees to this. Whereas if it's your ship returning without you, keep the black sails. Theseus, now unattached to Ariadne and unmoored, forgets in the flush with his victory, forgets to change the sails from black to white. And so Aegeus, looking from the cliff, again, keeps coming up, sees these black sails, thinks his son is dead, and then jumps off the cliff to his own death. So Theseus immediately is forced to become a king when so many heroes are much more happy gaining the kingdom than they are actually holding it. And Theseus finds himself far less capable as a leader than he was gaining power, right? Which all too often happens. And again, I believe this all comes back to this inexplicable abandonment of Ariadne. He takes a turn for the more tyrannical, and these extraordinary abilities he has, because they are aimed in the wrong direction, are now devoted toward tyrannical control. Athens itself becomes so abhorrent under his leadership that they exile him from the kingdom he really established. And he goes to a foreign king and sort of asks for help, and the foreshadowing comes full circle. That king, fearing his authority, fearing that he's going to try to establish his authority and use this as a point to be able to regain Athenian control, tricks him up onto the top of a cliff and topples him backward off of the cliff. That's the unfortunate end of Theseus, and the, I think, inevitable and really modern and applicable danger of honing your intellectual skills, your logical skills, without a guiding principle and the reason of defending people, the reason to free Athens, and the reason to put this Minotaur out of its misery. Those are all gone now, and that's what happens when we use these skills we've gained through education and through discourse and turn around and try to use them to defeat people in discussion rather than get to the truth below things.
And we see it all the time, as you just said. I don't know if you are a fan of a great TV miniseries from the 1970s called 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧, but I am. 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧 tells a fictionalized version of the earliest dynasty of ancient Roman emperors. And Claudius, the hero of this miniseries, is born in the royal court, but he has some sort of palsy. He limps and his balance is off and he speaks with a stutter, and everyone thinks he's an idiot, and so they don't take him as a threat. And he devotes his life to scholarship, and he's a genuinely good-hearted person. All of his family members who are trying to become the next emperor in one way or another end up ultimately killing each other. And those that actually succeed in becoming emperors, once they finally get there, before their own assassinations, are all horrific emperors that only drain Rome down the toilet. Finally, there's no one else left alive. Claudius is discovered after some massacre hiding in a curtain, and he's elevated into the emperorship. He doesn't really want to be it. He wants a republican form of government. He knows Rome isn't ready for it, but he actually is a good leader because he's never, through the process of gaining power, in a position where he throws away the qualities that made him ultimately become such a good leader. And so what you're talking about with regards to Theseus as opposed to Claudius, I'm hearing as a cautionary tale around, and you pretty much explicitly said it, the idea of letting that quest for power and what it takes to become that overshadow the skills that you need as a leader, and not being willing to recognize that leadership itself is an independent skill set that needs to be honed, developed, and contains some of the things that you may have left behind. Now, if you know you've left them behind, then you're at least positioned to be able to relearn them or surround yourself with those that can remind you of what you need to be and what you can be. And Claudius, by the way, in that miniseries, does it by having a couple of Greek advisors that are his loyalists by his side until the very end. Theseus didn't do that. He literally abandoned it. And one thing that I do find fascinating about this is this attempt he had to control the narrative about what happened to Ariadne. I mean, right, the alternate version of the story sort of represents that. The alternate version of the Ariadne abandonment is that Dionysus, the god of wine, wanted her. But what you're saying is that that is a narrative trick to sort of justify the purity of the mythos that Theseus is creating around himself. Now, the scary thing is, I understand that leaders may want or even need to have mythos around them, but do you believe that mythos or not? And I'm kind of hearing you say that Theseus believed his own hype.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. But I'll say also, you bringing up Dionysus, so too often people talk about Dionysus as being the god of wine when he is the god of intoxication. And you can be intoxicated by a desire for revenge. You can be intoxicated by sex. You can be intoxicated by music, right? So I wouldn't say that is outside of the realm of possible, that on a mythological level, Dionysus is what changes in Theseus. Like you said, he wants Ariadne maybe. So let's say Theseus gives in to Dionysian excess and intoxication, becomes intoxicated with himself. Leading toward that, his own downfall, which is the case for so many.
And let's face it, power is intoxicating. It really is, if you have the right personality type. That's, in a way, what the whole story of the Lord of the Rings is about. The ring as a temptation that causes people basically to become power mad, intoxicated with their own power. And Sauron's own intoxication with power that causes him to create the ring ultimately leads to the ring being destroyed by two people, two hobbits who had no desire for power, and leads to Sauron's complete loss of power,
Ruin.
even though he remains alive at the end of the story.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite parts of that is that you're exactly right to say it that way. Frodo is as close as you can possibly be to having no desire for power himself, but he has been swayed by it as well. Remember, he doesn't actually choose to get rid of the ring. He even
That's true.
Frodo, it's only strong enough to get himself there. So yeah, we are all highly susceptible to that sort of influence. That may be the only thing that, like Theseus as a cautionary tale, is that in a nutshell.
The journey to becoming what Theseus became from what he was can be gradual. It can feel like a bunch of little steps that occur that in aggregation, at some point that can be hard to understand or even draw a line around, has fundamentally changed who and what you are. Which leads us to something that you hinted at earlier that I'd like us to discuss as we really begin to move into the next phase of a conversation that could go on for 5 or 6 or 10 or 11 or 12 or 15 more hours. Let's talk about Theseus's ship.
Yeah. So for me, that's what I have started to, I coined a term called meta-mythology. One of the qualities that myth itself has, and it has a number of them, is that, like the ship of Theseus, which is a logical, a reason-based puzzle, that you can take a myth from 10,000 years ago and you can change what language it's in, and you can replace this detail with this detail, and the name can change over a while. And just like the ship of Theseus, which I'll explain for people that don't know, that myth may still have its mythness, let's say. It may still be telling the exact same myth with different words. And so, of course, the ship of Theseus is a logical or a reason puzzle, a logic puzzle about if the ship of Theseus over 500 years, because of this trip, he had to get the mast replaced and he had to get the flooring replaced during this, and then they came aground on this island, and so the outer shell, and then I'm not a boat expert, so I can't name more boat parts, but that poop deck definitely needs to be replaced. The sails, if after, whether it's 50 or 500 years, if every single piece of that ship has been replaced, maybe multiple times over, is it still the ship of Theseus? Is that question. And there are a lot of different answers to that. And I think sometimes it is yes, and sometimes it is no. There's a hidden golden thread that either remains or it doesn't. The obvious biological comparison would be the cells of our body, right? I know there are certain cells that do not replace themselves, but something about skin, and maybe this isn't even 100% true, but skin cells replace itself so much that you're an entirely different person after 7 years, or I think, again, it's an overstatement, but the point remains, of course, we're the same person. And why? It's not because you can come up with certain, brain matter doesn't replace as fast, or stem cells never replace. No, we would be talking about whether you are coming from a religious or an atheist perspective. some form of a soul, an essence, a point of view that represents who you are at the core. And you can change like a myth. You can change and alter and grow until almost nothing explicitly remains, but implicitly, I think plenty remains. Your thoughts, Scott?
Theseus, as the owner of the ship in question, is significant here. They could have chosen any ship. I mean, heaven knows, Jason, a zillion other people, Odysseus, all had their iconic ships. But to me, it goes as to the change that Theseus himself went through, that you have traced the narrative arc around, and that I mentioned earlier represents a change that some of us become when we seek something and make little shifts inside in the desire to obtain that goal, and whether we really become the same person or not. Similarly, there are sometimes events that occur that, in my opinion, completely shape, shatter, twist, destroy, or cause a phoenix-like rebirth of the soul, even though the body is the same. And in that situation, is the person the same? I say that personally because, as those who follow this show know, I had this terrible, sudden, out of the blue, shocking illness that occurred a couple of years ago. And it fundamentally changed me so much inside, even though my body recovered, that a lot of people that know me, including those most intimate, have said, the person I once knew is gone. Yet there's been continuity of my own consciousness, even as these foundational changes have occurred. When life events shift, whether we stay inside the same but physically are altered, or are physically the same but changed inside, thinking about Theseus's ship as a way to analyze where our journey is taking us and what we've become along the way is a pointer to, or an allegory for, the insight that I believe we need to have in order to be the sorts of leaders or the sorts of individuals that can meaningfully self-actualize no matter where the ship's journey takes us.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said, Scott, and probably a good way to tie things up. I've talked since the beginning of Theseus as a uniquely reason-based hero, a proto-rationality hero. So it's fitting that this philosophical, logic puzzle concept, it's so conceptual, just like all the villains Theseus faces are so conceptual. But it's obvious that there's something deeper too. This isn't a funny logical puzzle that you teach first graders. I mean, that successfully, like a fairy, conveys a certain concept to them. But I think maybe there's something uniquely human about this aspect, that if you have parts about yourself that you wish you could let go of, well, then you can take advantage of the ship of Theseus to shed those things while remaining true to yourself. Whereas if you have parts of yourself that are a remnant of something you care deeply about, you don't need to worry about them disappearing simply because the prima materia is fading away and being replaced. That core is going to remain. So I think it's kind of the best of both worlds in that way.
Something you said early in that last set of remarks points me to one of the many takeaways that I'm going to hold inside, ponder, and carry forward after this unbelievable conversation, which is that leadership, self-development, the desire to achieve our goals, the seeking to become our highest self, all requires not just will, not just hustle, not just drive, but a strong grounding in the philosophical, ideally combined with the rational. And that can be something that is easy to forget in the social media, sensationalistic, over dramatic and soundbite saturated world that we operate in which things like the Herculean model, brute strength, are valued over the philosophical, and can even lead to a culture in which the philosophical is ridiculed or viewed as worthless. Theseus is also a cautionary tale about what happens if we leave that capacity behind. If there's one thing that you would like the audience to take away from this conversation, Dylan, what might it be? Or is there something that you have wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to so far?
Maybe I'll do a little bit of both while keeping it short. Something that I hadn't really explored was how much the Minotaur, the image of the Minotaur, is the shadow, the exact opposite of the Theseus hero, and is yet very, very similar to what young Theseus wants to be. It's a grotesque version of what Hercules is, right? A brute strength beast that is not driven by Athenian wisdom by any stretch, but the exact opposite, right? It's got the head of a bull, right? And like you said, iron teeth, and it's the exact opposite of a centaur, or, one of these images that has more to do with the human mind taking dominance, but still giving life to that animalistic instinct below. So that's something I'm going to take away personally and explore a lot more, is what is Theseus really facing? You can almost imagine his facing off with Procrustes and Sinus and all these different figures, almost like, yes, he's coming from a good place, but you can imagine an angsty college student honing his intellectual tools and defeating people in bars. Yes, he's defending people from kind of, blowhards that are trying to, I love to hang around a bar and, like in Good Will Hunting, and use my Harvard education to jump in and embarrass people. So yes, it's great if Theseus, but he's not doing much different there. He's doing the same thing. And it's not until Ariadne and the golden thread that he faces the Minotaur, which is exactly that. Brute strength is nothing compared to the damage that honed but not guided intellectual prowess can do.
Wow.
And just like the king of the hill concept, if you pin your whole life on being the smartest person in the room, you are going to meet someone who is smarter than you. They're going to be able to run circles around you, and it is not a sustainable model. And if you take advantage of the few times where you are, or maybe not few times, maybe many times, have the highest reasoning power in the room. Oh, look, I can bully people intellectually at this moment because no one has come around the corner. Well, then a Theseus is going to come around the corner. And unfortunately, that happens to Theseus himself because he abandons that lesson. So that's the big takeaway for me.
That is, worth an entire other discussion, because heaven knows anyone who went through academics at the college and especially at the postgraduate level knows how much stock people put into their IQ, their intellectual prowess, as markers of their self-worth. And you see that in a lot of technically based professions as well. And you're right. this whole idea, oh, so-and-so is smart, so they need to be the head of a unit, or so-and-so is smart, so they need to be the president of the United States, or so-and-so is smart, so let's give them control of entire government agencies or beyond.
What could you possibly be referring to?
Yeah. Not any logical fallacies that actually occur in the world right now, surely. So that was a great point, and I thank you so much for ending the episode with a bang. Now, let's move on to something that people watching this show are crying out for. Dylan, they want to know what you're doing, where they can find you, more about what's going on in your life.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'll right now I'm pulling together a venture called 𝗦𝗫𝘆𝗲𝗵𝗆 Labyrinths. My goal is to very soon have it be called officially established as a nonprofit. 𝗦𝗫𝘆𝗲𝗵𝗆 Labyrinths, we touched on so many of these concepts, but it asks for the natural transformative power of the archetypal labyrinth and the way that can affect people, and hones it and uses it for storytelling purposes, for educational purposes, for wellness purposes. The list goes on. People are using meditation labyrinths, so we paint meditation labyrinths that you can buy that are on sale, Etsy,
cool.
etc., of different sizes for portable events, that you could bring to your wellness convention, or you could walk with your church congregation, or you could have a small one for personal daily meditative process. We're pairing up to be building some brick and mortar meditation labyrinths. And then very briefly, the final thing that makes 𝗦𝗫𝘆𝗲𝗵𝗆 Labyrinths quite unique is the idea of having QR code access to customized audio experiences that you can listen to in order to hone what are you going to get out of this labyrinth experience today. Do you want personal stress reduction? Are you at a school, and so when walking this labyrinth you want to deal with test anxiety? Are you wanting to learn about how the journey of the Odyssey relates to dealing with personal trauma in the body in a somatic way? So the sky's the limit there. We have not created all of these audio experiences, but we're moving pretty quick, and a lot of people are taking notice, which I love. So you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram. So, man, do I appreciate chatting with you, Scott. And the 𝗕𝗫𝘆𝗲𝗵𝗆 Cafe is a liminal space that I hope to return to soon as a viewer, and also as perhaps as a guest, because I've got plenty to talk about with other figures as well.
And make no mistake, you will be back. So that's not a question, that's a demand. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dylan. This truly was extraordinary. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to press the thumbs up as well as the subscribe button, and then make sure that you hit the bell so you get notification of future episodes. Also, leave a comment below. And if you have a mythical figure or a leadership issue that you want to have discussed, or a personal development issue that you want discussed in future episodes, also leave a comment about that below. We'd love to engage with you, connect, and hear what's going on. Make sure you follow me on my other social media channels, and then come back next time for another phenomenal chat here at the 𝗕𝗫𝘆𝗲𝗵𝗆 Cafe.